webinar, and as that piece of information probably just told you, this webinar will be recorded. So now you know that. This webinar is part of a webinar series organized by NTNU Energy Team Society. And just as a quick note on what that is, this is a cross-faculty initiative where we, on the one hand, conduct some research on our own, but where we also work to advance insights from the social sciences and humanities across faculties at NTNU into issues dealing with energy, sustainability, and related topics. And today, I think we have a really excellent webinar in store. We are visited by Hilde Refstie at the Department of Geography, who will talk about some work conducted with a series of colleagues. And then we have a discussant, Gisle Solbu, who has prepared some comments. And then towards the end, we'll do the usual sort of plenary discussion. And personally, I'm really looking forward to this one on the role of research in the world of fast policymaking, co-producing smart, sustainable cities. So, Hilde, go right ahead.
Thank you. I'll just share the screen here then. And I'm assuming that you see it now. Is that correct? Yes.
We see it. Perfect.
Yes. So the presentation today is a bit of a mix of several things. One is a paper that Hilde Nymoen Rørtveit and I are writing about different ways in which to research fast policymaking, where we draw on some of our earlier work on more area-based development in cities in Norway and Malawi. And the other is a study we've conducted with the help of a colleague, Leika Aruga, where we interviewed 25 university researchers and policymakers in Norway engaged in urban sustainability partnerships and also participated as observers in different events to explore how researchers reflect on their role in combating what Gunder calls pro-market interpretations of sustainable development that water down the concept of sustainability to literally that of business as usual. So quite a critical entry point into this. And with our project, we really wanted to explore to what degree this discussion is relevant in the Norwegian context, to what extent researchers can be expected to challenge both green, blue, and SDG washing as well in sustainability collaborations. And then lastly, if so, how well placed researchers are within current university incentive and performance structures to actually do so. But let's start with explaining what is meant by this concept of fast policymaking. So fast policymaking refers to the accelerated rate of experimentation that concentrates on policy shortcuts that can inform, as according to Peck, inform effective and visible forms of political action. And of course, it's beyond doubt that the immediate concerns captured in the 2030 agenda require an intensification of efforts and a change in tempo. But as shown by Peck and Theodors and others, fast policymaking tends to favor technocratic strategies pushed by well-resourced multilateral agencies over more organically grown endogenous approaches to policy innovation. And there's therefore a risk that while solutions are produced fast, they are not necessarily just or sustainable. And one example, Tavilzade, Montaigne, and Kullberg, they argue that urban politics and sustainability has become a hegemonic concept used to evade scrutiny and attract positive affection for any coalition of actors partaking in city development. And in their study, which is of the Gothenburg metropolitan area, they show how the urban sustainability discourse functions as a tool to make the city region governable so that infrastructural development housing can be continued in line with what they describe as a market-oriented economic growth first rationale. And I mean, their study is not unique in terms of how economic growth often continues to be prioritized over environmental and social equity concerns in urban policymaking, and while at the same time being branded as sustainability work. But what their study makes particularly visible is the different ways in which urban sustainability discourse can function as, in their word, a linguistic political mechanism with no essence other than attractive positive affections in order to accomplish something. And this is a key point, I think, but not the main focus in their paper. They also show how the language of co-production makes the results from this type of fast policymaking very difficult to challenge. Because, I mean, the 2030 agenda has, as we know, in many other, and the same as in many other places, really taken off in Norway. Oslo was appointed the European Green Capital for 2019 by the European Commission with visions of a green city securing a sustainable future for all. Tromsø is using its badge as a sustainable travel destination to attract tourists. We know that Bergen hosts an annual national SDG conference and has a lot of other initiatives. Ålesund, where I've been working a little bit lately, has developed a future lab as part of the UN's implementation program for smart and sustainable cities. And as we know, Trondheim has the Sustainability Center and has declared itself as taking the lead in promoting sustainable cities through this wider collaboration of cities in Norway and globally that puts really the sustainable city front and center in the urban development discourse. Sustainability as a term has also been embraced by industry and the private sector, and introduction to sustainability and the SDGs is increasingly how sustainability is operationalized in these collaborations, are now integrated into business and marketing management and education across Norway. And as we all know, NTNU also builds actively on the 2030 agenda and states that it will contribute actively towards achieving the SDGs. And to increase impact and relevance in knowledge for sustainable solution, co-production is very often emphasized. On the left here, we see photos from the University Municipal Collaboration 3.0 in Trondheim, which has the SDGs in the center. To the right here, we have from when NTNU signed a 315 million kroner deal with Equinor in 2019, and another one from a couple of months ago when NTNU signed an MOU with Equinor on collaborating towards net zero emissions by 2050. And the host of such collaborations is illustrative of how the co-productive turn in a whole range of sciences and in policymaking is currently playing out. And this, we would argue, has significantly changed the landscape and premises of fast policymaking. So co-production as a concept is used in very many different ways. So in this talk, I'll focus on co-production as the idea of involving multiple participants, such as scientists, policymakers, private sector, citizens, and so on, in knowledge production to together develop new knowledge, new ways of integrating knowledge into decision-making and action. And with that, which is often the aim as well, new outcomes in the world. And I'm sure many of you have mentioned co-production in a research application during the past year in one form or another, because, and I have myself as well, because it has become a very important buzzword, and it gets thrown around quite a lot in research application guidelines and in proposals, especially related to impact. And I've illustrated some of them in a buzzword bingo here, and many of the related concepts and words. And for good reasons, co-production has become a cornerstone of research and policymaking on sustainability. It's used as a tool for advancing new innovative knowledge, as a way to increase policy uptake in the general population, which I think several of you have been writing about, as a normative goal in terms of governance, as an analytical lens to better understand the ways in which science policy interactions are always ongoing co-productions, and also as a way to ensure research relevance. And it provides in many ways the primary framework for evaluating the organization and use of sustainability knowledge in global affairs, and guides design and implementation of a lot of international sustainability research and action. And that means that deepening understanding of co-production is therefore critical to effectively transition from assessing sustainability problems to identifying and deploying effective sustainability solutions. Now, it's difficult to see the inclusion of sustainability and the SDGs into collaborations, visions, and strategies as anything other than a positive development. And similarly, the partnership approach to sustainability and the emphasis on co-production and knowledge and solutions holds a lot of democratic promise in terms of opening up for more of a plurality of voices into research, into policy, into decision making. But as we know, the Sustainable Development Goals are framed as something that most people can get behind. And even though the interrelated nature of the goals is stressed, the framework opens up for possible cherry picking, making it adaptable to a host of agendas. And many authors have written about this, for example, Wilson on the politics of sustainability. And as put by one of the researchers interviewed in connection with our study, sustainability has become a huge fuzzy concept, and that is the problem with sustainability. It can be mobilized for anything. It's a very, very popular term to label plans with, and specific developments as well, because it's so positive a term and a positive concept. It's mostly misused as well. So everything and anything is labeled like sustainable or picked out like one goal here and a sub goal there. Or as asked by another researcher, what does this embracement actually mean? As they were saying, I think this year or probably last year, lots of national politicians started to have this SDG pin. You know, they have a pin on their jacket with different colors. And there were some media starting to question, what the hell is that? You know, why is everybody wearing that? What does that bring? Does that bring any substance to us? So I think the critique is not that the pin itself, but it's more, okay, what are you going to do with that? And co-production of knowledge and solutions have often been championed as a checks and balances to top-heavy bureaucracy, political elites, market power, and so on in sustainability processes. And it has, for me, included, and for many, represented a radical tool with the potential to democratize knowledge production, promote accountability, as per the slides before this, create more effective and legitimate solutions, and also to improve design, especially when it engages with citizens or marginalized groups who struggle with making their voices heard. But at the same time, and this has been discussed in critical development literature over 20 years ago, and Hilde and I engaged quite a bit with those debates, collaborative and co-productive processes can also mask interest conflicts and compel consensus while receiving legitimacy through the very same processes. And that means that it can function as a washing, where processes are portrayed as being inclusive and marketed as being inclusive, while at the same time enabling business as usual to continue. So more reflection is therefore needed on what the co-productive term means for the role we play as university researchers, maybe specifically in knowledge and policy collaborations. Because there are many pitfalls to be observed when co-production is used as a tool to, for example, ensure research relevance. One is the possible predisposition to uncritically accept priorities set by decision makers who operate within political and economic constraints that can favor clientelist approaches and short time frames. Election cycles is an example, or time-sensitive profit maximization. Another is to contribute to fast policy making that I talked about, that constructs simplified and definitive solutions that serves already well-capacitated actors. And the third, which is of course related, is to adopt existing policy categories and concepts without necessarily questioning their underlying assumptions or what they have been developed for. And Bakewell, for example, warns against conflating policy and practical research relevance. And in his call for more policy irrelevant research into forced migration, he argues that researchers tend to take the categories, concepts, and priorities of policymakers and practitioners as their initial frame of reference for identifying their areas of study, formulating research questions, and so on, and that this really privileges the worldview of policymakers in constructing the research. And to use an example from our study, a researcher reflected on how research priorities were formed in a collaboration on sustainable energy, which involved electricity providers. The researcher pointed out how there were only certain solutions in practice being put on the table, and that these were taken for granted throughout the project. And in the interview, the researcher reflected, so why is the transition about making more smart homes or making the electricity more flexible? And why don't we just use less? Because there's no money in it. So sustainability is in a way also part of the market in this sense. And this is illustrative of what came through in many of the interviews about the space for critical deliberations in projects and collaborations. And what was emphasized was not so much worries about hard state censorship or full privatization of research funding and so on, which has been a lot of the discussions in many other countries, that these impose limitations. Instead, what came up in different forms was how research could rather be seen to be nudged in certain directions. The researchers interviewed in our study considered themselves as being quite free in terms of choosing which collaborations they entered into or were part of. That might have been a bit different for younger scholars who often applies for particular projects. But for more senior scholars, they were also quite free in how they expressed themselves in those collaborations. But most acknowledged that funding structures and strategic directions coming from funding agencies and university management had a big impact on what projects and collaborations took place. And as put by one of the interviewees, the goal set for a research project, they reflected, is not based on identified problems. The goals are based on how you can access funding. And this brings me to the concept of nudging. And I've been a little nervous to bring this up at the Team Society webinar, because there are usually many environmental behavioral experts here who know this material much better than myself. But I'll give it a go to illustrate the point. Because those of you familiar with nudge theory, and this might have been up at other Team Society webinars as well, you might know this from the form of the story of the fly at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam in the 1990s, where the airport manager was trying to reduce spillage around urinals and therefore settled on putting this small photorealistic image of a fly near the drain. And the result was an amazing 80% reduction in spillage. And this is one example of what the economists Thaler and Sunstein and others call nudging, which is a form of soft paternalism that steers people in certain directions without taking away their full choice. And in the academic context and in our study, this refers more to how research is being nudged in particular directions through funding incentives, partnership preferences, and performance indicators, which is put forth by an increasingly top-down and externally governed university sector. Because in the co-productive turn, universities are increasingly expected to engage with industry, national and local authorities, and citizens to stimulate development and drive societal impact. And in concert, research is increasingly commercialized and innovation-driven, and universities compete with other research institutions for funding. And with that, new partnerships are formed, often under the head of co-production, that really blur the lines between basic research, applied research, and contract research. And this quote put up here is by Stephen J. Ball in his I Spy Guide to the Neoliberal University almost 10 years ago with reference to the UK. I mean, Scandinavian universities have been and is seen as more of a stronghold for university autonomy, since we have the historically firm support for government-funded basic research. But New public management has steadily made its inroad into the sector also here, and research priorities are increasingly set with reference to national strategies. And a lot has been written about this lately. And in order to compete for external research funding, research has to respond to a number, and internal too, by the way, to a number of preset criteria and tick the right boxes. And this has given rise to critical conversation about the key mission, or as many see as the key mission of the university, including myself, to challenge prevailing orthodoxies and enlarge the democratic sphere for the benefit of the wider public. Because as put by one of the municipal workers interviewed in our project, when discussing the role of the university in sustainability collaborations, where is the line between being a research institution and a consulting company? There are many dilemmas. I generally think the level of conflict is too low. There are far too many who get away with too much without being challenged on basic assumptions. And also how we're not used to often talk about power relations. As put by one of the researchers interviewed, everyone thinks and behaves like we have the same power, but in reality, it's not so. And we need to have a conversation about the different roles of actors in sustainability collaborations. It's really difficult for us as scholars to navigate the landscape. And this is, I only have one more slide after this, I think, to navigate the landscape where the problem is more about these questions never posed, the articles never written, and the collaborations never formed, maybe more about that than about any absolute restrictions on academic freedom. And it's also a level of reflection that we seldom get time and space to get into. And here I think we have a lot to learn and can take inspirations from different currents within academia, such as the call for more reflexive co-production sustainability science, and alternative debates on research relevance and impact coming from action research, feminist social sciences, and post-colonial social sciences, and also the slow scholarship movement, because what they have in common are thorough reflections and discussions on ways in which to balance multiple imperatives of research to be rooted, critical, explanatory, and actionable. Because answering questions about what we do and do not do as an academic collective requires us, as called for by Gisle and Mitchell and others, to frame the search for research relevance within explicit discussions of either the politics of relevance or of the social practices that condition relevance. And this, I believe, is crucial. And we discussed this 2 weeks ago at the Finnish geography meetings in Oulu, where we had a talk. Because it impacts our collective ability, really, to contribute to sustainable solutions. And there is simply no time for fast policy making. Yeah, and I think I'll stop there then.
Fantastic. So then let's see now in Zoom, I'm looking for the applause button, but it's behind my camera. So, but those of you who can access your buttons, please do click them now. We have some comments from Gisle prepared. Gisle, Solbu, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Hilde, for this very interesting presentation. I thought this was also a very nice opportunity to reflect on our own practices when we are now, a lot of us, I think, in the process of applying for projects and reading through project calls from the Research Council and so on and so on. So this was a very timely wake-up call, I think, for ourselves to think about our own role as researchers. I think I don't have a lot of comments, but I think I just want to make some more general comments to try maybe to open up this discussion. And I will focus mainly on this kind of problem of co-production, participation, collaboration that you point to. And my background is in science and technology studies. So this has also been a very hot topic here in our field, I don't know, since maybe the early 2000s. And to me, what is very interesting in this kind of like issues, this is not only something that is pushed by the governments or by the funding agencies, right? So this is also something that has been largely pushed and introduced through the research communities and through the social sciences, and especially the science and technology studies field. So we kind of have created our own enemy in some sense here as well. This is very interesting in itself, I think. A recent example of this, I think, is this idea of responsible research and innovation that has now been like really pushed into the Research Council of Norway. And here we also see this intention that the researchers actually should have a very like explicitly reflexive role. You know, this kind of collaborations and this integration of the social scientists into the natural sciences project is done on the assumptions that the social sciences should contribute with a reflexive role in these collaborations. So here it's said very clearly that this should be the role of the social sciences or the humanities for that sake. But still, we find the same kind of problems that you are pointing to here in this more other collaborations, that there's much that is getting done, and in some extent these efforts to try to like enhance the reflexivity, enhance the kind of critical reflection when we do research has not been very successful. And I think that's kind of two sources to that kind of that this kind of failure, in this, that they come in a stage where they feel like the problems is already set, like you point to also in your presentation, like the agenda is already been articulated, or they feel like there's not like, okay, we can talk about it, we can sort of include, we can bring voices into this kind of research project, and we can try to sort of broaden the perspectives that we have and be critical, but then, okay, what happens next? So we're sort of dealing with this very like big sort of stable structures that makes things very difficult. So I think a lot of the problem here is exactly what you point to in your presentation, that these efforts to push this more co-productionist approaches to doing research has been very naive towards the politics involved in these types of collaborations. But then also listening to your presentation and hearing and reading the quotes, and especially this quote that you had on your last slide here, there seems to be kind of, there is still a critical capacity among these researchers, right, that are involved in this kind of collaborations with these industry partners or with these municipalities. So my question here, the first question is sort of, okay, what are our sort of understanding of processes of change within these collaborations? So what do we see then as kind of a successful outcome of collaborating with partners when we have this kind of very big stable interests that have a lot of power? What would be this kind of critical reflexive role? What do we see as a possible outcome of engaging with these people? Could we also think more incrementally towards the way we think about change in this type of constellations? Like maybe like that things also could happen more gradually. I don't know. I'm just trying to have like a little bit of a positive spin towards it, because even though a lot of these RRI efforts have been quite unsuccessful, I would say, we also see some success stories where relationships have been building over time, you know, when you have people engaging in the same type of collaborations year after year after year. So it would be interesting to hear you like just reflect a bit on what would be sort of the processes of change here, and how can we sort of address that?
Great. So do you want to respond, Hilde?
Yes, I can try to do that. And I might also call on my colleague Hilde Rørtveit a little bit too. I think it's really interesting, and also what you talk about, the focus on responsible research and innovation, and also that social scientists get this particular role of being reflexive. Yes, I do agree that, you know, social scientists are maybe better equipped to be more reflexive and might have more tools in the toolbox in a sense, but there's also huge variations there, right? You can have very positivist researchers who do not acknowledge these types of politics influencing science, for example, also within social science. And you can have like we have physical geographers who very much take critical reflexive stands. So it's interesting, that type of reflection, which I think you have worked much more on. But I also think it's problematic if that is something that's sort of outsourced to one particular researcher in a collaboration. And especially, as you say, very often you might be invited in late, agendas might already be set. And not always by those in those actual collaborations either. It can go back to guidelines from the Research Council or from particular innovation project setups and guidelines and so on. And I do think also, as you say, critical capacity is there. And I also think quite a lot has happened within sustainability collaborations. And I'm focusing mainly on urban areas, but a lot has happened just the past 5 years. And I think the work that has been done through Team Society and also many other groupings at NTNU, for example, has really brought many of these debates to the fore. And a lot of that has happened in the past about 5 years. But I think what we're trying to also show a bit with this study is more the concept of foreclosure as well, because it's something about which partnerships and collaborations we end up entering into. And for me, who has worked a lot with action research, for example, and groups of citizens who are mobilizing and so on, that's a very different entry point than starting to work with, for example, Trondheim municipality, or starting to work with a commercial actor on something. But it's quite hard to find avenues for that more bottom-up research, and also working with more non-traditional partners who might not have the same resources to create a meeting point with researchers and with others. So I think what I'm most concerned about is, are we moving towards more of a culture, a monoculture of research, where we do involve more actors, but at the cost of other actors who are not so visible? And is that also a more of a nuanced problematics in this, especially as co-production is getting a lot more emphasis? And there are many good things about it, but it's something, and I think in development studies, for example, the focus on power relations and so on, those discussions have come much further than what we observe maybe in many collaborations here. But Hilde, do you have some thoughts about that too? Because we are writing a bit about those North-South dialogues in terms of acknowledging power in collaborations.
Well, I'm not sure if I have so much to add on that at the moment, but I was thinking when you presented Hilde, because I'm in Uppsala right now as a guest researcher, and what I realized is that there's so many researchers now who are we have all this crisis going on, the environmental crisis, it's the climate crisis, it's and there's a lot of, especially young researchers who have this very sense of urgency. And maybe that goes kind of collides with this slow scholarship movement. We don't have time to not have research that is actionable at the moment. So we have had very interesting discussions, especially with younger researchers here in Uppsala, on the role of researchers and the possibility to take time to, yeah. So this sense of urgency, I don't know, because we need research to come with solutions as well. Yeah. And it's definitely possible, perhaps, to have two thoughts in the head at one time, at the same time. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, we had I was part of a PhD course in Finland like 2 weeks ago, where this was much of the discussion during the week too. But what came up there also with the scholars there was about how hurrying in the wrong direction, that type of discussion as well in terms of fast policy making. And it's really difficult, I think we all feel that sense of urgency, right, to come up with actionable items that can actually solve something. And at the same time, there's not so much space to reflect on the sum of what we're doing as, for example, a university, in terms of, are we moving in the right different directions and so on. But that's also a question back, I think, to all of you who are here, how you do that in your work, and what you would say qualify, back to Gisle's question about what is successful in terms of your role as researchers in that sense.
Great. So, Gisle, do you have further comments, or should we open the floor for the other participants?
I have one more comment, but you can also open up if.
But go for it, and then
Go for
while
it.
you say it, rest of us think of our questions and sharpen them.
No,